The air in the hospital room is stale, smelling faintly of antiseptic and impending death. It is 1945, a year that will go down in history as the dawn of a new era. But for the patient lying in the narrow bed, history is a distant concern. He is weak, perhaps hopeful. He watches as the doctor approaches, a figure of authority and salvation in a white coat. The doctor prepares a syringe. The patient extends his arm, trusting that the clear liquid entering his veins is a medicine designed to heal, or at least to soothe. He does not know, he is never told, that the syringe does not contain a cure. It contains plutonium. This scene, played out in the quiet shadows of a post-war American hospital, was not an isolated incident of medical malpractice. It was a fragment of a vast covert operation orchestrated by the United States government. As the Second World War transitioned into the chilling silence of the Cold War, scientific ambition collided violently with medical ethics. In a nation drunk on the power of the atom, the citizens themselves became the raw material for testing that power. From 1944 to 1974, hidden behind the walls of classification and national security, the US government conducted thousands of radiation experiments on its own people without their consent. For decades, these files gathered dust, stamped secret, burying the voices of those who were sacrificed on the altar of nuclear supremacy. It was not until the presidency of Bill Clinton, half a century later, that the light of truth began to penetrate these dark archives. In 1994 and 1995, the Advisory Committee on Human Radiation Experiments, AHRE, established by President Clinton, uncovered a staggering reality. Their investigation identified approximately 4,000 recorded experiments conducted on human subjects. These were not enemy combatants or prisoners of war. They were American citizens. However, even this shocking figure is shrouded in ambiguity. Whispers among researchers and historians suggest that the official count may only be the tip of the iceberg. It is rumored that the real number of victims could exceed the official data by several times, as countless documents have been conveniently lost, destroyed, or remain classified to this day. The story of these experiments is a journey into the moral vacuum of the mid-20th century, where the fear of nuclear war justified the unjustifiable. 1944, 1947, birth of the atomic age and first victims. The Manhattan Project is remembered for the thunderous mushroom clouds over New Mexico and the devastation of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Yet there was a quieter, more insidious side to the birth of the atomic age. The project birthed not only the bomb, but also a series of cruel experiments on human beings, conducted far from the battlefield. Between 1944 and 1947, as the world reeled from war and began to rebuild, a small group of American scientists turned their eyes toward the biological effects of the new radioactive elements they had harnessed. They needed to know what these invisible killers did to the human body, and laboratory mice were no longer enough. They needed human subjects. During the specific period from April 1945 to July 1947, the machinery of this covert research began to turn in earnest. The records, later unearthed, paint a grim picture of exploitation. Under the guise of medical treatment, doctors injected 18 patients with plutonium. 6 others were injected with uranium, and 5 received injections of polonium. None of these individuals gave informed consent. They were treated not as patients with rights, but as biological containers for radioactive isotopes. The epicenter of these early injections was not a secret underground bunker, but the sterile, respectable halls of hospitals in Berkeley and San Francisco. The operations were overseen by figures of scientific renown, most notably Joseph Hamilton, a physician and professor of medical physics. Hamilton and his colleagues operated with a terrifying sense of detachment. The criteria for selecting these human guinea pigs were brutally simple and rooted in a dark pragmatism. The scientists specifically targeted the hopelessly ill. These were men and women already facing the end of their lives, individuals whom the doctors believed would die anyway. In the twisted logic of the time, their inevitable deaths made them expendable assets for the state. The interpretation was clear. The potential contribution to science and, by extension, to national security outweighed the rights and dignity of a dying human being. Consider the atmosphere of those clinical encounters. A doctor stands by the bedside, clipboard in hand, meticulously recording the metabolic changes in a patient's body. He tracks the pathway of the isotope, noting how it settles in the bones and organs. The patient, looking up from the pillow, perhaps feels a surge of gratitude for the attention, believing they are receiving experimental therapy that might prolong their life. But there was no therapy. The injections were designed solely to measure how quickly and where the radiation would accumulate, providing data to protect workers in the nuclear weapons complex. The patient was a proxy for a factory worker, their body a calibration tool for safety standards. This period marked the crossing of a Rubicon. The ethical boundaries that define the relationship between doctor and patient were dismantled in the name of the atom. The birth of the atomic age was also the birth of a state-sponsored program that viewed its most vulnerable citizens, the sick, the dying, the powerless, as resources to be mined for data. These first victims, injected with the very substance that fueled the bombs, were the silent casualties of a war they didn't know they were fighting. They were the first, but they would tragically not be the last. 1948, 1952. Invisible clouds over cities. As the 1940s drew to a close, the scope of the government's curiosity expanded ominously. The isolated hospital rooms of the previous years were no longer sufficient for the questions plaguing the atomic scientists. They needed a larger canvas. They needed to understand the mechanics of catastrophe on a macro scale. Consequently, between 1948 and 1952, the methodology of testing shifted from the needle to the wind. The focus turned to the sky. In a series of operations that transformed the American landscape into a vast, open-air petri dish, the government conducted 13 intentional releases of radioactive substances into populated areas. The objective was clinical and cold, to study the dissemination of fallout. To achieve this, entire cities were converted into unwitting laboratories, their inhabitants reduced to data points in a grand experiment of dispersion. Imagine an ordinary morning in a quintessential American town during this era. It is a tableau of post-war optimism. The sun is rising, casting long shadows across manicured lawns. Children, clutching lunchboxes, walk in groups to school, laughing and trading baseball cards. Housewives hang laundry on lines to dry in the fresh breeze. It is a scene of perfect normalcy. Yet, the people on the ground remain blissfully ignorant of the invisible threat drifting above their heads. They do not see the radioactive cloud mingling with the morning air, settling silently on the playgrounds, the rooftops, and the drying clothes. The terror of these experiments lies in their calculated nature. These were not accidents or leaks, they were deliberate acts, according to persistent rumors and fragments of historical analysis. The timing of these releases was far from arbitrary. It is whispered that the tests were meticulously coordinated with weather services. The scientists did not wait for the wind to blow the danger away from civilization. On the contrary, they allegedly waited for conditions that would ensure maximum spread over inhabited zones. The wind direction was chosen to carry the particles directly over the laboratory, the towns and cities where people lived and worked. Documentation of these events remains frustratingly incomplete. A definitive fact regarding this period is that the tests were often not fully documented, whether through negligence or a deliberate strategy of plausible deniability. Many details have vanished. The logs are patchy, the precise compositions of the clouds are often missing, and the exact trajectories of the fallout are left to speculation. This era marked a terrifying escalation in the government's approach to human experimentation. It was no longer about a single doctor deceiving a single dying patient. It was about an invisible hand reaching down from the sky, turning the air itself into a weapon of research and enveloping entire communities in a toxic secret that would not be revealed for decades. The citizens breathed, the children played, and the scientists watched from afar, measuring the drift of the invisible clouds. 49. Green Run, the dirtiest experiment. The night of December 2nd, 1949, descended over the Hanford Engineer Works in Washington state, cloaking the sprawling nuclear complex in darkness. But inside the facility, a secret operation was underway that would mark the culmination of Cold War paranoia and scientific cynicism. This event, known as the Green Run, would go down in history as the dirtiest intentional release of radiation in the site's history. The objective was driven by the shadows of geopolitics. American intelligence needed to develop a methodology to track the Soviet Union's nuclear progress. To do this, scientists decided to simulate the processing of green fuel uranium fuel that had been cooled for only a short period. Much like the suspected Soviet practices, they needed to test their own aerial detection systems against a known source. To create that source, they turned the Hanford plant into a massive smokestack of poison. In a calculated move that defied all safety protocols, operators dissolved a ton of fuel elements and deliberately bypassed the filtration systems. Without scrubbers to trap the particulates, a massive plume was ejected directly into the atmosphere. The numbers are terrifying in their magnitude. Between 5,500 and 12,000 curies of iodine-131 and xenon-133 were released into the night air. To put this into perspective, it remains the largest single dose of iodine-131 released at Hanford until the catastrophic explosion at Chernobyl decades later. The execution of the experiment was as reckless as its conception. The test was conducted at night during adverse weather conditions. A temperature inversion trapped the radioactive cloud near the ground, preventing it from dispersing into the upper atmosphere. Instead of drifting harmlessly away, the concentrated fallout hugged the earth, rolling silently across the landscape. The radiation did not stop at the fence line. It spread for 200 miles, blanketing the Pacific Northwest and touching the lives of thousands of unsuspecting residents in Washington state. The valleys and farmlands, the lifeblood of the region, were soaked in invisible isotopes. The human cost of this experiment is best captured in the eerie calm of the following morning. As the sun rose on December 3rd, farmers in the surrounding valleys woke up to start their daily chores, entirely unaware of the events of the previous night. They walked out into the crisp air, breathing in the remnants of the plume. They looked out over their pastures, seeing only dew on the grass. They did not know that the vegetation was coated in iodine 131. They did not know that as their cattle grazed, the animals were ingesting a lethal dose, concentrating the radiation in their milk that would soon be on the breakfast tables of local families. The Green Run had successfully simulated a Soviet process, but in doing so, it had turned American citizens and their food supply into collateral damage. 53. Project Sunshine and the theft of children's bodies. The year 1953 brought with it a government initiative bearing a name that evoked warmth, light, and life, Project Sunshine. But behind this cheerful moniker lay one of the most macabre chapters in the history of nuclear testing. As the Cold War intensified, scientists became obsessed with strontium-90, a radioactive isotope found in nuclear fallout that mimics calcium. They knew it entered the food chain, specifically milk, and settled in human bones. To understand the global extent of this contamination, they needed bone tissue, specifically young, growing bone tissue that absorbed calcium most avidly. The project evolved into a grim global harvest. Without the knowledge or consent of grieving families, a network of researchers began collecting the corpses of infants. In total, approximately 1,500 bodies of babies and young children were gathered from across the globe, spanning the United States, Europe, and Australia. The dead were not laid to rest intact. They were shipped to laboratories to be cremated and analyzed for radioactive content. The secrecy surrounding the acquisition of these bodies was absolute and calculated. In declassified documents, the scientists themselves stripped away the medical euphemisms, engaging in chilling discussions about body snatching. They were acutely aware of the legal and moral precipice on which they stood, yet the demand for data drove them forward. For the parents, the tragedy of losing a child was compounded by a deception they would likely never discover during their lifetimes. Persistent rumors and later investigations suggest a pattern of cruel manipulation. Mothers and fathers, paralyzed by the shock of losing a baby, were approached by hospital staff requesting permission for a routine autopsy. They were told this was standard procedure to determine the cause of death. They were never told the true purpose. They were never told that their child's limbs, ribs, or vertebrae would be excised and sent to a government lab to measure the byproducts of atomic bombs. The geographic reach of Project Sunshine turned the entire world into a supply chain for human samples. From the hospitals of Brisbane to the morgues of Chicago, the death of a baby was transformed from a private family tragedy into a bureaucratic opportunity. In the eyes of the project leaders, the infant ceased to be a human being and became a biological filter, a mere container of data to be mined. The ethical interpretation of this period is stark. The scientific thirst for knowledge had completely eclipsed the fundamental right of parents to bury their children whole, turning the silence of the morgue into a source of stolen data. The 1950s, experiments on expendable people. As the calendar turned to the 1950s, the criteria for selecting human subjects underwent a dark evolution. The randomness of the early experiments gave way to a systemic targeting of the marginalized. In this decade, The cold calculus of science became intertwined with the deep-seated racism and ableism of the era. The government and medical institutions began to look for victims among those who were considered expendable by society: the poor, racial minorities, and the disabled. In the segregated wards of the Medical College of Virginia, a horrifying reality unfolded. Here, the victims were predominantly poor, African American patients. Trusting the medical establishment to heal their ailments, they were instead subjected to brutal experimentation. Records reveal that doctors injected these patients with phosphorus-32. These were not therapeutic amounts designed to cure. The doses were staggering, up to 50 times higher than the accepted normal limits. The suffering was immense, yet to the researchers, these individuals were merely biological vessels used to test the limits of radiation tolerance. Simultaneously, on the other side of the country, a different kind of horror was taking place within the walls of the Sonoma State Hospital in California. Between 1955 and 1960, the institution, tasked with caring for children with cerebral palsy, turned into a research facility for the Atomic Energy Commission. Little-known documents suggest a grotesque violation of trust. Children with severe disabilities were subjected to painful spinal taps to study the effects of radiation on the central nervous system. Even death offered no sanctuary. In a final act of exploitation, the brains of these children were surgically removed post-mortem for further analysis, often without the full comprehension or valid consent of their families. Beyond these documented atrocities, the 1950s were rife with rumors of even wider experimentation. Whispers persisted that pregnant women attending routine prenatal checkups were given cocktails containing radioactive iron to track the transfer of isotopes across the placenta. Other reports alluded to the creation of artificial radiation fields in public schools to test detection equipment, turning classrooms into testing grounds. The tragedy of this era is best crystallized in a single, quiet moment in a clinic waiting room. A mother sits on a hard wooden bench, clutching her sick child. She is tired, her clothes are worn, and her face is etched with worry. She has come here because she has nowhere else to go, believing that the doctor behind the door holds the key to her child's health. When the door finally opens, she stands up, filled with hope. She watches as the physician prepares a treatment, grateful for his attention. She does not know that the liquid in the vial is not medicine, but an experimental poison. She does not know that in the eyes of the state, she and her child are not citizens to be protected, but material to be used. 1963, San Francisco. Proving ground. By the ocean. By the mid-1950s, the focus of nuclear testing shifted from remote deserts and isolated hospitals to the bustling coastline of the West Coast. The Naval Radiological Defense Laboratory, NRDL, situated at the Hunters Point shipyard, turned the city of San Francisco and its surrounding waters into a massive, open-air proving ground. For 7 years, between 1956 and 1963, the boundary between a military facility and a civilian metropolis blurred, as the region became a chessboard for radiological warfare simulations. The statistics from this period are clinical but chilling. Records indicate that at least 24 distinct studies were conducted involving 1,073 human subjects who were exposed to radiation. While the official narrative claimed these tests were safe and controlled, the data reveals a different story. There were at least 33 documented instances where radiation doses exceeded the safety limits established at the time. The primary method involved field tests using lanthanum-140, a radioactive isotope capable of emitting powerful gamma radiation. These tests were largely conducted on military bases scattered across the Bay Area. The human component of these experiments consisted mostly of young servicemen soldiers and sailors who were trained to follow orders without hesitation. This creates a disturbing picture of betrayal within the ranks. Little-known details suggest that many of these participants were kept in the dark regarding the true nature of the risks they faced. They were soldiers, not scientists, and they stood where they were told, marching into zones of contamination or scrubbing down radioactive hulls, unaware that they were part of a medical study on radiation exposure. Their loyalty to their country was used as a mechanism to expose them to lanthanum-140, with no explanation of the long-term consequences that might fester in their bodies. Beyond the fences of the military bases, a darker suspicion hung over the city, like the famous San Francisco fog. Persistent rumors and theories of conspiracy suggest that the testing was not strictly confined to military personnel. There is a belief that the spraying and dispersion of radioactive materials were conducted in densely populated civilian areas to achieve maximum realism. The logic was terrifyingly pragmatic. To understand how a dirty bomb or nuclear fallout would affect a living, breathing city, the scientists needed a realistic environment, streets, houses, and crowds. In this scenario, the unsuspecting residents of San Francisco became extras in a simulation of the apocalypse, breathing in the sea breeze, unaware of what else it might be carrying. 1971. Cincinnati. Racial genocide, disguised as treatment. As the civil rights movement fought to dismantle segregation in the streets of America, a different, quieter form of oppression was being practiced within the sterile walls of the medical establishment. Between 1960 and 1971, the University of Cincinnati became the site of one of the most egregious betrayals of medical ethics in the 20th century. Here, under the supervision of Dr. Eugene Sanger, the intersection of science, classism, and racism produced a program that many have since characterized as a form of localized genocide. The subjects of this experiment were not volunteers stepping forward for the good of the nation. They were more than 90 cancer patients, overwhelmingly poor and African American. They came to the hospital seeking relief from their suffering, trusting the white coats and the institution to provide them with the best possible care. Instead, they were funneled into a Pentagon-funded study designed to measure the effects of high-level radiation on the human body specifically, to simulate the conditions a soldier might face on a nuclear battlefield. Dr. Sanger and his team subjected these individuals to total body irradiation. This was not targeted therapy aimed at shrinking a tumor. It was a massive, systemic assault on the entire organism. The doses were debilitating. The patients suffered intense nausea, mental confusion, and a rapid decline in health. The most damning fact of this decade-long operation was the absence of truth. A verified, reliable fact stands at the center of this tragedy. The patients did not give informed consent. They were never told that the radiation levels were experimental or that the treatment was funded by the Department of Defense to study radiation sickness rather than to cure cancer. They believed they were being healed, while in reality, they were being calibrated. The interpretation of these events points to a systemic rot. The selection of victims was not random. It was determined by race and class. The researchers exploited the vulnerability of low-income black citizens who had few other options for medical care. It was systemic racism in action, reducing human beings to biological data points based on their socio-economic status. Parallel to the individual horrors in Cincinnati, another atrocity was unfolding in the American Midwest, turning entire neighborhoods into test zones. In St. Louis, the government conducted a series of aerosol tests that would haunt the city for generations. Radioactive substances were sprayed into the air in more than 30 different locations. The targets included public housing complexes and schools areas densely populated by working-class families and minorities. The operation was vast and indiscriminate. For decades, the residents of St. Louis lived with the consequences, watching cancer rates climb and health issues proliferate, often without knowing the cause. The legacy of these open-air experiments is not a closed chapter of history. It is an open wound. The injustice is so profound that as recently as 2023, survivors and their descendants were still demanding answers and financial compensation, fighting to have their suffering acknowledged by the government that poisoned the air they breathed. Conclusion: declassification and unhealed wounds. For decades, the victims of these experiments lived in a twilight of confusion and pain, their suffering dismissed as bad luck or natural illness. It was not until the geopolitical frost of the Cold War began to thaw that the government finally admitted to the darkness it had harbored. In 1994, President Bill Clinton established the Advisory Committee on Human Radiation Experiments, HEHRE, tasked with opening the vaults of the atomic age. The committee's findings, published in 1995, were a vindication for the survivors and a shock to the public conscience. The investigation confirmed what many had long suspected, but could never prove. Thousands of cases of unwitting exposure were documented in black and white. The government had indeed used its own people's sick patients, soldiers, prisoners, and children as raw materials for nuclear research. While some families eventually received apologies and financial compensation, for many, the admission came too late. The checks could not reverse the cancers, nor could they restore the trust that had been chemically and radioactively dismantled. Yet, even with thousands of pages released, a heavy silence still hangs over the archives. Persistent rumors and the frustration of researchers suggest that the full scope of these experiments may never be known. Many operational records were destroyed routinely over the years, and others remain buried deep within the labyrinth of classified intelligence, protected by the eternal shield of national security. The official count of victims is likely a fraction of the reality. Looking back, the era stands as a terrifying testament to a moral vacuum created by fear. The Cold War did not just build walls between nations, it built walls between science and ethics. In the race for survival against a nuclear adversary, the United States convinced itself that the sacrifice of the few was necessary for the survival of the many. Science, stripped of its humanity, became a tool where the end justified any means, no matter how cruel. The story ends not with a period, but with a question mark. Picture a dimly lit government archive, the air thick with the smell of old paper. On a metal shelf sits a cardboard box, heavy with files, stamped in red ink. Declassified. It represents the truth we are finally allowed to see. But as the camera pulls back, the shadows reveal rows upon rows of other boxes, stacked floor to ceiling, their lids taped shut, their contents unknown. How many stories remain locked inside? How many victims are still waiting in the dark? The box is open, but the wound remains unhealed.